Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Glendale Audit Committee meeting. Roll call, please.
Audit Committee Member Ed Khachadurian.
Present.
Tom O'Shaughnessy.
Online, region 5x5.
Alex Parahone.
Present.
Vahik Saturian is absent, and Chair Zari Amirian.
I am here. Let's move on to the business agenda, please.
The business agenda is the agenda for today, April 30th, 2020. Audit Committee meeting was posted on April 27th, 2020 on the bulletin board outside of City Hall.
Thank you. So we have oral communications next, and I'd like to say a couple things. We're in a unprecedented situation, obviously, and here in the city of Glendale, we are taking the order to commit to social distancing very seriously. And so, as you see, I am the only commissioner who is present, and we have 3 of the 4 remaining commissioners joining us on the phone. If you are interested in participating in oral communications, you may call in at 818-937-8100, and you'll be able to do that. So we'll actually move oral communications at this point and move on to item number 4, please.
Item number 4 is approval of the minutes of the Special Audit Committee meeting held on January 27th, 2020.
Okay.
Move to approve.
Could you identify yourself and...
This is Ed Khachadurian, sorry.
Okay, thank you. I have a motion,
I second.
and that would be Mr.
Alex
Parahone.
Parahone.
Thank you. Roll call, please.
Yes. Audit Committee Member Ed Khachadurian.
Yes.
Tom O'Shaughnessy.
Abstain.
Alex Parahone.
Approved.
Vahik Saturian is absent, and Chair Zari Amirian.
Yes. Okay, we have no action items today, so let's move on to item number 6, please.
Item number 6 is reports and information. Internal Audit Activity Report as of March 31st, 2020. Jesse Zhang, Internal Audit Manager.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and Audit Committee members. This is Jessie Zhang, Internal Audit Manager. Today, I would like to provide you a report on the internal audit activities for the quarter ended March 31st, 2020. So there are 7 sections within this report.
Jesse, if you'll
Jesse,
if you'll pause 1 second so that I can tell people not to do exactly what I just did. So
Sure.
if you know, normally during our meetings, we allow questions to happen in real time as they come up. Today, we're going to be a little bit more formal. We'll allow speakers to finish, and then we'll open up questioning and comments for the commissioners after each speaker. Okay? Sorry about that, Jesse. Go on.
No problem. Thank you for doing that. So during this past quarter, we've issued 1 audit report. It is a contract compliance audit of the city's parking garage operations. At this time, I would like to invite our internal auditor, Ani Antonishian, to present her audit report to you. So, Ani, please go ahead.
Thank you, Jesse. Good afternoon, Chairman Amirian and Audit Committee members. Today, I will be reviewing an audit on the contract that the city has with the vendor to operate and manage city-owned parking garages. The city's Public Works Department is responsible for parking operations. The Parking Division is responsible for management of the city's parking assets, including the city's publicly owned parking garages. The city's contract with a vendor to operate and maintain the city's parking facilities costs $15.7 million. The contract is currently in its 6th year of service. Per the contract, the vendor is supposed to operate the 3 main downtown garages, Marketplace, Exchange, and Orange Streets, as well as the Civic Center garage here at City Hall, and perform limited services at the Larry Zarian Transportation Center, which has been scoped out of this audit. The purpose of the audit was to determine whether adequate controls are present to ensure that the garage revenues are being collected and reported accurately, that the maintenance expenditures are substantiated by appropriate supporting documentation, and that other contract provisions were being followed by the vendor. The audit process included review of all garage invoices, various revenue reports, including those prepared by staff and system-based. We also conducted interviews, inquiries from the parking vendor, the parking system vendor, and walkthroughs of the garages. We also performed compliance tests for various contract provisions, including the contract budget, staffing, maintenance, expenditures, and garage revenues. The downtown garages are open around the clock and offer free parking for the first 90 minutes and a $2 per hour rate thereafter, with a maximum daily rate of $9. Monthly passes are also available for $70 a month with a $15 activation fee. The 3 main downtown parking garages use WPS, a parking access and revenue control system to manage revenue collection through the various pay-on-foot machines available at the garages. Payments can be made both through cash and credit cards. Intercom staff control all 3 garages remotely and are available to assist customers through the intercom button available near garage exits. WPS system also allows for end-user reporting on total garage revenues, contains data on cash collection and machine cash levels, and monthly parking passes, which are also known as key cards. All revenues received for fiscal year 18-19 covered the direct contract costs for all garages. However, Civic Center and LZTZ, as you can see, do not generate a lot of revenue and have more expenses generally. The parking garages receive revenues from various sources, including sales from daily transient tickets, monthly key cards, validation sales, and valet. For fiscal year 18-19, revenues from all sources totaled to $3.3 million, which included 51% from daily sales and 44% from monthly parking passes. 62% of total payments was made through cash or check, and 38% through credit card. Total expenses for the garages, by which we mean just direct contract costs, for fiscal year 18-19 were $1.6 million. The biggest chunk of these was for parking staff, followed by providing for security personnel. And the next category of large spending was for maintaining the garages. The parking contract was awarded for a not to exceed $15.7 million to the vendor for an initial 5-year term with 2 1-year extensions. It is in its 6th year currently. The vendor is responsible for operating and maintaining the downtown garages, Civic Center here at City Hall, as well as providing some services at the LZTC. The vendor is responsible for staffing, maintaining, and securing the garages, either through its direct or subcontracted staff, as well as managing the collection of all parking fees. In total, the audit had 13 observations. 6 of these are priority 1 and thus more critical, and I will be highlighting them in the next section of the presentation. I will not be highlighting the 7 priority 2 issues, but they are detailed in the audit report. And the 4 issues have to do with, number 1, not all active monthly cards are being billed. 2, cash collection process has inadequate controls. 3, revenue reporting lacks system-based support. And 4, staffing requirements are not followed. So we'll review audit result number 1, not all active monthly key cards are being billed. The parking vendor switched to a new billing system midway through the contract with the hopes that the new billing system would better integrate with a parking system, WPS. However, our review showed that 22% of the active key cards in the parking system could not be matched to the billing list, and 8% of these key cards from our sample were not being billed, but were being used by parkers regularly throughout calendar year 2019. Overall, we recommend reconciling the billing system to the parking system, which is currently not being done, performing a follow-up audit after this reconciliation takes place, and to enhance controls over the monthly key card process, including segregating key duties, clarifying policies, and establishing a collection policy. Audit result number 2, cash collection process has inadequate controls. We reviewed cash collection from all parking machines for June 2019 and noted that the actual cash collected from the machines needs to be documented in order to provide a clear trail of any overages or shortages to the machine reported total. In addition, any POS audits that are performed need to be documented and its results need to be reported to the city. And anytime a POS is opened, an identifier card should be used to provide a clear trail for ownership of cash. Audit result number 3, revenue reporting lacks system-based support. We noted that all around the reconciliation between the billing system to the parking system will benefit not just the monthly parking pass operation, but also, for instance, the valet revenues that depend on the usage of monthly key cards. A key recommendation for the revenue side is to provide the city with system-based reports for all revenues, including monthly key cards, valet, and paper validations. A transaction detail report from the parking system would further enhance revenue controls, which are not available currently. This report should tie all revenue sources to parking entries so that all entrances are accounted for automatically. We also recommend that revenue collection and remittance be audited periodically, as they are substantial. Last audit results that I will highlight: staffing requirements are not followed. Per the parking contract, the vendor has not been complying with staffing requirements, as key positions have not been filled since the start of the contract, including parking auditor, analyst, or positions have not been filled consistently or appropriately. Additionally, a key position such as intercom that should be manned 24/7 did not have complete coverage for the sample week that we reviewed. We also compared the current parking agreement with a similar agreement that the vendor has with a neighboring city and noticed that the workers' compensation rate was significantly higher for our city than that of the neighboring city. We recommend that the vendor provide clear methodologies for all payroll costs, which we have not received to date from the vendor. We also compiled a list of best practices based on audit recommendations from parking contracts that can be used by parking staff. These best practices highlight ways that parking staff can ensure that contracts have stronger controls built in for both existing and future contracts with vendors. For instance, adding vacant positions to the list of conditions outlined under the liquidated damages section of the contract, or requiring that the vendor provide a methodology for all payroll costs, including workers' compensation rates, on a periodic basis, subject to the city's approval, and requiring that the vendor use non-proprietary billing systems, and that these systems fully integrate with any parking systems that are in use, and addressing what may necessitate a formal amendment to contracts, such as a major billing system change, delineating the maintenance items that are to be serviced by the city, and periodically monitoring garage budgets at the individual budget line item level and adjusting the budget in the beginning of the year for any items that will not be used during the year. This completes my presentation. I'd like to recognize and thank Tad Dombrowski, the city's parking manager, Edward Hiddy, Assistant Director of Public Works, and Yazdan Imrani, Director of Public Works, for their assistance throughout the audit process and for attending the audit committee meeting. We are all here and available to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Antonessian. I'm going to open it up to questions from the commissioners.
Chairman Amirian, this is Ed Kashadurian. May I ask a question?
Yes, Ed, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much for the presentation. I have actually two sort of like questions. I'm still not so sure about the audit result number 2 that talks about cash collection process that has inadequate controls. I'm imagining that the system that the vendor utilizes registers all of the cash that is collected, right? It's just that, is it not reported directly or correctly on their statements, or what is the nature of that issue? The other question that I had was regarding the staffing. You mentioned that apparently there's a position called parking auditor and analyst. What is exactly the role of these analysts? Aren't they supposed to provide the reports? And if they haven't hired this position, how do the vendor, submit their reports?
Sure. So on the first question about cash collection, you are right. The system has a transaction report of sorts that does show the total that is owed to the city, and we checked against that total, and they are sending the total to the city. It's just the actual cash that is collected from the machines may not necessarily total to that system reported number, right? There's always some type of a shortage or an overage due to any kind of bill jam that might happen. So the actual cash that was collected was not being documented. That's the major problem in number 2. Is that does that clarify the question issue?
Yes. So if I understand this correctly, there is no miscalculation. It's just that the handling process is not well documented.
Right. Right.
Okay.
And for number 2, the parking analyst position hasn't been filled to date, and I'm reading the contract now. This position would be responsible for data analysis, and this wasn't being done. And that's also one of the recommendations we have, is that there is a lot of data in this parking system that, as we were auditing, we were kind of also looking at many reports that were not being reviewed. So this kind of type of analysis that the city would benefit from is currently not being done because the position has not been filled.
May I ask another question, like a follow-up to this list, last one?
Go ahead, Ed.
Do you know if they're doing this with you? You mentioned that they have another contract with one of the neighboring cities. Do they do the same with the neighboring city? Do you know that? Do you happen to know?
Right. So that we did not look at that, but Tad, would you have an answer to that?
Good afternoon, Commissioners. This is Tad Dombrowski, the city's parking manager. I do not have an answer on how they handle it. Each garage typically in the operation itself varies. This one is centrally controlled with multiple garages, so that can vary on what type of positions that you hire for and what is required in the contract.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Parahone or Mr. O'Shaughnessy, any questions?
I have a question.
Mr. Parahone.
Yes, Alex Farhone. My question is the tickets that the patron receives when they obviously enter the structure, is there a tracking or an audit that was done on that as to how many missing tickets there were, so forth?
Right. Yes, we did take a look at that. It's not like in the old days where we're actually looking at. Well, we did take a look at the actual physical tickets, but modern systems should have these transaction detail reports that are automated, which is one of the recommendations. Is they don't have that, so they should try to obtain that. But yes, we did count actual tickets for a day, and it wasn't matching up to what the system was reporting for that day.
Because I'm assuming there should be a report of lost tickets somehow,
right.
Or loss of revenue. Obviously, you generate from there.
Right, and so
right.
we we didn't find an issue with that because they were consistently sending us what they are supposed to.
Okay. And then the other question I actually had is, there's several facilities, but I didn't hear, you only mentioned, I think, the one that was actually a deficit in revenue. Or were they all profitable in regards to the parking garages?
Sorry, I didn't hear that last part.
I said, are they all profitable, or are they losing money on these parking garages?
So if you take, I think we have a chart in the audit where a couple of the garages, the Civic Center at City Hall and LZTC, are generating more expense. They're not generating revenues to cover their expenses, but the expenses are not as much as the other garages.
This is Ed Cash. Oh, sorry.
No. Who just?
This is Ed again. I have another question.
1 second, Ed. Let's get through. Let's see if Alex has any more questions, and then we'll come back.
Well, the other one I actually had is, so obviously we're hearing that the operator of the facility isn't keeping up with the with the staffing and so forth. So there's obviously probably some lack of segregation of duties, I'm assuming, there as well, just because someone has to go in there and collect the cash, I'm assuming, from the machines, unless the same person is doing both tasks. I'm not sure. Do you guys have any response to that?
Yeah, on the segregation of duties, we did observe cash collection, and the major issue, as I said, was that the actual cash wasn't being documented. But in terms of the custody of cash, had good controls, except for the identifier card. So every time they opened the machine, aside from the key, they also use this card that says who opened the machine. So our recommendation was to use that consistently, because when we looked at the entire years of collection, there were a few times that card wasn't being used. So that provides custody, cash custody. And in terms of segregating of duties, if somebody, they are collecting the cash double custody, and sometimes 3 people are there, security personnel. And when they bring it to the office, another staff member checks the cash, and another person takes it to the bank for deposit.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm good.
Thank you, Mr. Parhon. Let's Ed, if you'll hang on 1 second. Mr. O'Shaughnessy, do you have any questions?
They were answered by a prior commissioner's question.
Fantastic. Thank you. Go ahead, Ed.
Thank you. So in the beginning of the presentation, I think you mentioned this $15.7 million. Is it the contract amount for 5 years or something like that? And I was looking at the revenues, the annual revenues and the cost. So the revenues that you reported was $3.3 million, and then the cost of operation was $1.6 million. What is the relationship between this $1.6 million, if you're in the 6th year of the program, to that $15.7 million? Or maybe I didn't get something correctly when you were just talking about that $15.7 million. Could you just maybe clarify that?
Sure. So the $15.7 million was given for the 5 years plus the 2 optional year extensions. So it's actually for the 7-year period. It's the not to exceed contract cost.
Okay, but the actual costs are less than that, right?
Are you talking if they exceeded? Are you asking if they exceeded the budget, or I'm not, because the contract's not over yet.
No, I understand it, but based on these annual numbers of 1.6, if you multiply it by even 7, that comes out to less than 15.7 million.
11.2.
Right.
Right. So that comes out to 11.2 million or thereabouts. So So they are, in terms of the total cost, we are staying within that allotted budget, right?
At first glance, yes, but we do have a finding on the budget monitoring and adjustment. So if you take a look at, we took a look at for fiscal year 18-19 as you're looking at the budget, they are staying within those line items. For the year, they're not exceeding the budget. However, the budget wasn't being monitored or adjusted. So if those positions that we mentioned were not being filled, if there weren't any contract issues, then we would be able to know if that actual number is, we could use that number against the budget. Does that make sense? Because there's an issue with the contract terms not being fulfilled.
Oh, okay. So you're saying they are under budget simply because they haven't filled the positions. Is that what you're trying to say?
In a sense, yes. We cannot conclusively say that they are under budget and the quality is being delivered on the contract.
I see. Okay. But is there a chance that they will come back and, let's say, just for a second, let's go with these numbers. Let's say that for all 7 years or the first 6 years of the program, they charge $1.6 million. That will come out to 1.6 times 6, $9.6 million. This gives us a leftover of like almost $5 million. Is it possible that they come back and claim $5 million in this 7th year of the contract, showing that they have hired people or they have done some other things, or at this point we can conclude safely that regardless of their failure to meet all of the contract stipulations and expectations, they're not going to come even close to the allotted budget?
That's correct, because each year had a predetermined budget set up initially, even before the contract started. So, and they, so each year for each garage, the budgets are regulated. They won't be able to exceed at this point, I don't think. And Tad, correct me if I'm wrong.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. This is Tad again. Yes, that's correct. The $1.6 million expenses for that fiscal year, the budget was actually around $2.4 million. And once that fiscal year is passed, they don't have any access to prior fiscal years. So that is a true savings for the city, even though we didn't receive some of the services that we would have liked to.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, this is Chair Amirian. I have several questions. So I had a question regarding this 5-year contract with the 2 1-year extensions, and we're in the 6th year. So it sounds like the maximum amount of the contract to not exceed is $15.7 million, but we're nowhere actually close to that in terms of the 6 years, the past 6 years. Do we have an actual number of what that looks like? What the last 6 years look like?
We didn't take a look at, Ted, do you have that number by any chance?
I don't have an exact number in front of me, but we have had significant salary savings in each year, probably similar to this, where it's $500,000 to $800,000 per year in annual savings.
Actually, Mr. Amirian, I do have that number. So from July 2014 to June 2019, the contract had expenditures of about $9 million, but it had a budget of 10.5 as of last June.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. And given this audit, and this might be a management question, are we looking at putting out RFPs? This 1-year extension, is this a mutual extension? Is it the City of Glendale's extension, or is it an extension on behalf of the vendor?
This is Chad again. It is at the city's discretion.
At the city's discretion, okay. And what are the plans for the 7th year?
The contract, I believe the last year of the contract is in the process of being executed now.
Okay. Was there any look at, putting this out for proposal early?
Commissioner Marion, I believe the goal right now was to take a lot of these findings in the audit and not only be able to address them over the next several months, but also be able to incorporate them into any future RFPs as well.
Okay, that makes sense to me. Thank you. The 22% of the key cards that don't match, along with the 8% that just seem to be free parking, could you explain what exactly doesn't match? First of all, is there revenue for those 22% and that 8%, or is that just not there?
Sure. So from what we looked at, and I'd like to begin this answer by saying that we were not given access to the billing system that would contain the revenues, and we would be able to do a thorough check, so we didn't have access. So we only were able to sample 25 key cards from the 2,499 active ones in the parking system. So there are two systems. There's the parking system that controls the garages, right, remotely and has all kinds of reporting. And there's the billing system, which I mentioned is proprietary to the vendor. And whatever is active in the parking system are those cards that parkers actually go and key in and out of the garage. So there were 2 out of the 25 that we sampled that were basically parking for free for most of 2019. And our recommendation is that the vendor a follow-up audit be performed and the parking system and the billing system be reconciled so we can get an accurate number of exactly how many parking passes we are not receiving revenue for.
Did you follow up with those two with those two free parkers to see if they had actually paid?
No, they were not paying.
They were not paying at all.
No.
But that's according to whom?
That is according to the fact that as you look into the parking system, you see activity for those key card numbers, but when you look at the vendor's billing system, there was no invoices being sent to that parker.
I understand.
For the same period of activity.
I understand that. What percentage of the people who are monthly parkers pay in cash? Is it a significant percentage?
It's actually, do you mean, so all of it is cash. Credit card payments cannot be taken. It's only credit card or check or cash. I'm sorry, cash or check.
Okay. So I think maybe an extra step would be to, first of all, we need access to their system. I mean, that part of it is just, especially since they went from a non-proprietary, which I assume we had access to, right?
I don't think so. Tad, did you have access to Paris? Did your staff have access to Paris?
I had a account set up for me. I did not log in and use it, and then it was switched over to the new system.
Okay. I mean, I think the question is, you have a sample size of 25, which is fine, and you have 2 of the 25 you found that weren't parking, and so I'm wondering if those numbers extrapolate to the whole, and the question that's interesting to me is whether the people just some people just walk up to an office or want to pay in cash? Did something like that occur? And it might be prudent to follow up with some of the actual customers and see if they paid or not.
Okay.
Is that a possibility?
I think that if the vendor is going to be reconciling that they are always in communication with their customers, so they would take that step. But we can, as we're following up on these recommendations, ensure that they are doing that.
Okay. The workers' comp number. So the city was paying what percentage of payroll in workers' comp?
So our city is being charged 21.05%. But when we looked at Pasadena's contract with the same vendor, it was 14% of their 14% of their payroll costs.
You looked at what city? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Pasadena?
Yes.
Okay. So the same company was charging Pasadena 14%, but was charging Glendale 20 some odd percent.
Right.
And how did they reconcile that? What was their response?
We haven't received a response to date.
Okay. What are some possible explanations for them charging us more? And by the way, 20 some odd percent of payroll for workers' comp sounds ludicrous. So are we going to get an answer on that before we extend them out to the 7th year? That might be a Todd question.
Yes, we are working, and we actually sent them an email, I believe, last week asking for a follow-up on that. We're definitely going to be not just looking at it for the current year, but as well as past years as well.
Okay, would you please provide that to staff as soon as you get it? Because I'd like to, I'd probably like to see it before the next meeting if that's at all possible.
Mr. Chair, I have a question.
Yes, Mr. O'Shaughnessy.
Any chance whenever the time comes for a new bid for the parking that we look into having open source so that there is no software that we cannot access?
I believe, Mr. O'Shaughnessy, that if I'm stepping on the foot of staff, please let me know, on the feet of staff. I believe one of the recommendations was to require in future contracts non-proprietary software versus proprietary software.
Perfect, I missed it.
Yeah. So actually, we did not. We said that if they have proprietary systems, that regardless of whether it's proprietary or non-proprietary, that the city has access for review and auditing purposes, and that is explicit in the contract, in future contracts as well.
Wonderful, thank you.
I've got one more question. In terms of, you mentioned that over the past, from 2014 to 2019, I believe you said it was $9 million. What were the revenues during that same time?
Well, while Ani's looking to see the exact numbers, I can tell you the revenue has been consistently in the 3 to 3.5 million range for the last several years.
And is there any revenue sharing in the contract?
No.
Okay.
Thanks, Ted.
Okay, well, I appreciate the, if there are no more questions from my fellow commissioners, I appreciate the report. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to getting some follow-up on the questions that were asked, and just getting some follow-up from the actual vendor on some of these answers. I'm sure the city is looking into it as well. I know our city's management, and there's no way they would let that slide. So I'm hoping that we get some answers to those questions, and then we'll go from there. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, this is Jessie.
Yes, Jessie.
Yes, we'll follow up with the department on the workers' comp percentage, or how they determine the percentage issue. And also later on, I'm going to cover the quarterly follow-up. They actually have all the 6 items listed within the activity report, this report. So we will be reporting back to you on a quarterly basis.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, let's move on, please.
All right. Thank you, Ani, for the presentation, and thank you, everybody, for the very thorough Q&A. The next item in this report is project in progress. So I'm not going to go over each one, but I do want to mention that a couple of the projects that we're working on have been impacted by the COVID-19 situation. One of them is the Basic Life Support BLS program audit. This audit is currently put on hold because it is with the fire department, and then they do not have time for us right now, and it's very understandable. So, last thing we want to do is to take away, I don't know, the rest or the sleeping time even from our first responders. So this is one of them. Another project was also impacted by COVID-19 is the PCI compliance audit, because I believe half of the counters, mostly library and the parks, have been closed. So we are currently working closely with the city's PCI compliance team to determine what's the best way to conduct this audit and when. So that's the 2 projects so we have a total of 5 projects currently in progress. So any questions on that?
I'm going to open it up to the commissioners. Any questions on that portion?
O'Shaughnessy, no questions.
Thank
No
you.
question from Alex.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay, let's move on, please.
Okay, so the next section is continuous auditing. So during the past quarter, we have completed 2 continuous auditing testing. Both were completed in February of 2020. One of them is the duplicate payment testing. We did not find any duplicate payment made to vendors during the period reviewed. And another one is the user access control Active Directory testing. We do have some findings and recommendations. Those were provided to ISD in February. So that's the 2 for continuous auditing projects. And just be reminded that continuous auditing we conducted is not to replace the control monitoring activities that are still the responsibilities of the management. So the next section is a follow-up. So section 4, 5, and 6 are all related to audit follow-up. So we have completed our quarterly follow-up process for outstanding audit issues by communicating with department representatives on implementation status. So for this past quarter, we have followed up with departments on 57 outstanding items from 12 completed audit projects, of which 13 new items were added and 14 were implemented, which left us with 43 outstanding items at the end of the quarter. The completed quarterly follow-up report with the detailed follow-up matrix was provided to city manager and the executive team on March 16, 2020. I do want to take this opportunity to acknowledge that many of the departments are extremely busy dealing with COVID-19, and we really appreciate the continued support received from each department. So despite this current situation, actually 25% of the outstanding items that have been implemented during this past quarter, and a lot of progress that has been made. So internal audit, my entire team truly appreciated the assistance received from the management that allow us to continue our audit activities. So the next section is a summary of outstanding priority 1 audit issues. So these are, we have a total of 10 outstanding issues, but 6 of them were actually added this quarter. That's from the audit you just heard. And then 3 of them were actually very close to being implemented. So we made progress on that. The last part of the quarterly follow-up discussion is related to outstanding audit issues and meeting discussion criteria. We don't have any items this past quarter. So that's for all the follow-up sections. Any questions before I move on to the last section of the report?
If this is not appropriate,
Mr.
until the
O'Shaughnessy.
end of the meeting, I'll bring it back. But is the audit department considering, in consultation with the city manager and the treasurer, reopening the audits that you have scheduled for the year based on the fact that sales tax revenues have got to be in the cellar and the income to the city has got to change dramatically? And is the budget being reviewed for a 5, 10, 20, or some percentage possible cut depending on income? And that's probably a question for the next meeting.
Well, I can address it briefly. This is Michelle Flynn, Director of Finance.
Thank you.
On Tuesday, May 5th, we will be doing our first budget study session with City Council, and we will be reviewing with them the COVID-19 impacts that we have incorporated into this current fiscal year's budget as well as next fiscal year's budget. So Council will be getting a full report on that on Tuesday.
Thank you. I saw that on Channel 6, but I wasn't sure exactly what it meant. Thank you, Michelle.
You're welcome.
That's all.
All right, thank you. So last but not least, the advisory services section 7. So we listed the teams and programs that members from the internal audit team participated. Besides the ongoing advisory roles on the investment policy advisory committee, the PCI DSS compliance team, and the ERMC, all members from the internal audit team have actually completed a citywide Lean Six Sigma Black Belt training and worked on 3 citywide projects that focus on improving efficiencies and effectiveness. So this is a citywide training program that IPA worked with the Professional Development Center of GCC, Glendale Community College. It's a 16-week training program that opened up for all city employees who are interested. So this class has a total of 11 students from 7 departments, and we listed the project the team worked on and the team member and the department they're from. So that concluded the quarterly activity report. Any questions? This one or other sections?
Any questions?
None for me, O'Shaughnessy.
Thank you.
Okay. For me, Alex Farrell.
Thank you.
No question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Zhang. And, I just wanted to echo your appreciation for what the employees here at the City of Glendale, management, and everybody is doing during this time. Police, fire, especially those first responders, are so important, and we appreciate everything that they're doing, and also appreciate that they're taking the time to continue to participate in what is really, really an important process of internal audit. So thank you for that. So now I'm going to bring up oral communications, which I tabled for this portion of the meeting. I have no phone calls. I think it's because we did a wonderful job in asking all of the pertinent questions, and everybody is satisfied. So that's how I'm going to read it. And let's move on to item number 7, please.
Item number 7 is audit committee or staff comments.
I'm actually going to take this opportunity to start this portion off, and this might not be in the right section. It might be new business, and I'll depend upon Ms. Varapetian to let me know if that's the case. So, as everybody knows and they can see, we are dealing with a situation that's unprecedented. We've never, in the history of our country, shut down to this extent in order to deal with, a threat like a virus. And so, in dealing with these unprecedented times, I think there are opportunities here especially for our audit function, to look at, multiple aspects of the city's response to this pandemic. And the entire kind of mission statement of internal audit is to provide analysis on risk, or gap analysis based upon expected performance versus actual performance. And I think the City of Glendale, with the response that I've seen, has a wonderful opportunity here to be a leader in terms of the manner in which we look at, how municipalities respond to these types of issues. I know that there are disaster recovery and continuity plans in place, and I'm confident that the city is following the plans that they put into place. But I do think that there's an opportunity to look at whether those plans were exhaustive, whether they covered the right things, where our opportunities are, where our risks are. And that's really what internal audit does. At the same time, I understand that right now, everybody's in an emergent situation, but I would like, given the fact that internal audit and our audit universe and our audit plan is a living and breathing, plan, something that we modify on the fly. As Ms. Zhang mentioned, there are 2 of the audits that we've currently put on hold. I think I would like, staff to consider what it would look like to, what type of audit might be done, to help inform management who right now is, running with blinders on, focusing on really making sure that the city continues to function and that the residents are safe. There are multiple factors to this, whether it's economic, health, just governance in general, best practices. So I would like staff to look into how we can leverage the capabilities of our fine internal audit function in helping identify risks that maybe weren't considered or weren't considered as fully as they should have been, and also to highlight our successes. And so I hope that we are able to assist the management and at the same time provide the stakeholders of the city of Glendale with the information and assurance that our government is doing everything it possibly can and doing it in the right way, and also really preparing for what happens next. We live in a different world now than we did a month ago, and since we've shut down the government and there's so much unknown about this virus, we want to make sure that the city management, the council members, all of the relevant stakeholders, department heads, have all of the information necessary and in order to make the best decisions both now, in real time, and in the future. It would have to be in phases. You might look and assess key risks associated with the organization, the organization's response to this coronavirus. You might look at that first, and then you could also, perform a gap analysis in terms of what the city's expected response was to this type of emergency and how the city is performing. And it's really about providing us with the best information possible in order to address these issues moving forward. I want to again emphasize that everything that I've seen as a resident of Glendale for now 20, almost 30 years, I've been a resident of Glendale. Everything I've seen has been wonderful, but I do think that internal audit will play a significant role in ensuring that the city and management has the best information possible in order to continue dealing with this situation and also dealing with any situations that come up in the future, whether it be a pandemic or an earthquake, anything that would require large portions of the city's staff working remotely, or dealing with some of the risks that are associated with that, and also looking at a much broader view of how to respond whether the plans in place fully covered, what the actual threat is. So I'd like to direct staff to look into that, please. And I'm open also to any feedback from my fellow commissioners. Thank you. Are there any comments from other commissioners? And then we'll move to staff. Okay.
No comment from Alex.
Staff comments? Okay. So just to be clear, and maybe Ms. Varapetian can help me here, is this the proper area of the agenda, or do I have to, would I have to go under new business? Considering that we're, in order to direct staff to look into how internal audit can leverage their strengths in order to potentially perform audits of the city's response to this coronavirus pandemic.
Chair Marion, members of the audit committee, this would be the appropriate time to bring that up, but I do have to check with Ms. Zhang about how we go about mid-year amending the annual audit plan, whether that's done during a committee meeting where committee members agree to it, because as you know, when we develop a plan, all committee members comment on it, vote on it, move the order of priority, and we certainly can't do that at this meeting, but I just want to be sure that offering a suggestion during oral comment is a proper way to amend the process of adding new audit items. But across the board, and perhaps Ms. Bolbolian will be able to comment on that, the emergency response team frequently, when an emergency is declared, there is a post-op that happens, obviously not as an audit department would, but certainly sort of a debrief. So there are certain mechanisms that are in place that review post-emergency the lessons learned, things that could be changed, things that could have changed, things that we need to change, and just develop an overall plan of how to address that. The emergency plans obviously are, for every possible scenario, are prepared. There are tabletop exercises. I think the last time when we discussed pandemic viruses was in the context of the bird flu. So there are manuals that we go back to, and there are tabletop exercises, and I think but it's not in the context, I think, of an audit that you're proposing. So I would go back to my original question to Ms. Zhang about how we add new audit items to your overall annual plan.
Hi, this is Jessie. Thank you, Lucy, for the explanation and the question. As the chair mentioned, our audit plan is based on risk assessment, and the plan is supposed to be flexible and dynamic based on the changes of risk. So we know nowadays COVID-19 is the number one risk that everybody is talking about. So with that said, across our internal audit industry, everybody is also talking about it. But then it's not whether we should do something or we should, internal audit should do something about or related to this risk or related to
the emergency response plan. The question is how, because the internal audit would like to always to be helpful and add value to the city, but at the same time, we don't want to get in the way. We don't want to take away the responders' time. We don't want to take away, or become the part of the problem. So our team has been, learning and studying, just like everybody else. I think that in this situation, this is something that is, I don't think a lot of people have experienced. So we have some ideas and to how to add value to the organization. The projects, like the chair mentioned and Lucy also mentioned, that we put certain projects on hold, and then we are able to. I think at this point it's a balance of keep the continuity of our business, which is to continue to do the audit based on the risk assessment, because the city is still try to keep the business continuity. So then those risks are still there, and the pandemic risk or the emergency response plan related risks should be evaluated. So then my plan was to work with the management to at least assess the risk related to this. One idea is to perform a gap analysis between the city's current emergency response plan to best practices, and then to see if there's anything we can improve. But the specific scope and methodology, how do we do this audit, I think is more critical at this point. We will work with the management on that.
Ms. Yang, how long would something like that, how long would that process take? I mean, our next meeting is scheduled for when?
In July.
Okay. And so, if we're not meeting for another approximately 3 months, I think one of the reasons why I mentioned what I mentioned was because, waiting to look at this after the fact, I think is what most organizations, whether they're municipalities or businesses, a lot of them are going to do that. But I think that the city of Glendale, with its management team, with its employees, and with the strength of our internal audit, has the ability to figure out a way to do that is minimally invasive, and to work with management in order to leverage your strengths to identify those, that gap, as you were mentioning, between expected performance and what the plan was in place. How long do you anticipate those discussions taking?
You mean how long the discussion or how long the project?
No, the project, I imagine, it depends upon the scope, and that's a fairly substantial scope. But I'm curious whether, and maybe other staff, I'm curious whether we should have the audit committee meet in a special meeting in, say, 4 weeks in order to get a response to that.
If I could just quickly just interject with regard to the process, and
yes, Ms. Varpet.
Yeah, that'll determine whether or not we need to meet. My question, more specifically, Jesse, is how does the plan get augmented? Are you is that something that you would be able to incorporate? Is if you're already considering doing some sort of an audit, is that something that you would be able to do? Would you, or do you need direction from the audit committee in order to add another audit item to your plan? That's the procedural question. If you need the overall audit committee to give you direction, and the audit committee and the department itself isn't considering doing the audit, then we would need another meeting so that we could provide very specific direction on what the scope of the audit would be. But if you don't need to meet, and it looks like Ms. Yang is already considering some type of an audit, then at the next meeting, she can report on the type of audit that she has considered, contemplated, began, and maybe even in the middle of, receive additional direction on how to change the scope. So it sort of depends on how we go about auditing or changing our plan.
This is Jessie. We don't need a formal approval process. Audit committee has the authority to direct us. So then I take this, what Chair request as the direction. And basically, we're kind of clear on what the objective of this audit is going to be, which is, does the city have an effective response plan that follows best practice and being executed properly? And then in terms of the scope and the methodology, I think that's the part that I will work with management to figure that out. So does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. And so to your original question, Chair Marion, with regard to whether or not this is the appropriate time to submit a request for audit to incorporate an additional item to the audit, the answer is yes, and it looks like the direction was received, and that's it.
Okay, I appreciate that.
Do we need a second?
Mr.
And
O'Shaughnessy?
motion on that?
No, because this is oral comment, and as I understand it, we don't need a consensus that an individual committee member could provide that type of direction.
Am I correct that when I heard what the chair requested, we're looking at recovery and resumption of city services as part of that?
I mean, I think that's up to, obviously that's the goal. But, the overriding goal is that we get through this together in the best way possible that affects, the minimal number of lives. And I don't just mean, people who might unfortunately be dying or affected by the actual virus directly, but also, what the impacts are on the infrastructure of the city, on the residents of the city, their businesses. So, I mean, it's a pretty broad, that's a pretty broad question. And I think the first step is just looking at what the city's current disaster and continuity plan is and how it's being implemented in real time versus what best practices might be, and applying a risk assessment to that in terms of looking at what the potential risks are and whether or not they're being properly considered, given the weight that we now know, acting in real time, reacting to all of the, whether it's the orders that are coming down to shelter at home, or whether it's the shutdown of the businesses. But most importantly, it's about the city's infrastructure and the city's response. Telecommunications, city personnel, what type of risk you might be putting people who all of a sudden went from being very happy and showing up at work and being productive to all of a sudden being asked to perform their duties remotely or a portion of their duties remotely. Whether there's process risk, whether there's, system and security risks. There are multiple things that can be looked at that are a big part of the city's response. And I feel like waiting until after, all of this is concluded to look at that is dropping an opportunity to really be a leader and also highlight, how good of a job the city's doing.
I concur. In fact,
I just called.
I'm sorry.
This is the oral comment period, and I think this discussion has gone pretty long. I think the direction is pretty clear. If there are some follow-up questions, certainly staff can follow up, but I may just ask you to conclude your comment so that it doesn't slip into a discussion.
Thank you.
No further comment.
Okay, let's move on to the next item, please.
Next item is number 8. It's new business.
So I guess in this area, it might be prudent to bring up potentially having a meeting sooner than 3 months from now in order to be able to offer some feedback as an entire committee on what staff and the internal audit and management have discussed, and how the plans are kind of panning out. So I'd like to propose having a special meeting, in say 4 weeks.
Chair Marion, along those lines, the chair does have the ability to call for a special meeting. If I could suggest that maybe we postpone that discussion to a time where there is a better sense of what the audit scope is after they've had the opportunity to review and work through management on how the department and the committee could be most helpful, and then report that back to you so that you could help develop the agenda to have a proper discussion at that time. I think it may be premature to have a discussion now about when that meeting should be without really knowing how much work needs to go into it.
Fair enough. Then I will wait for some sort of response from staff, and then I will determine whether or not we require a special meeting in order to discuss as a committee and direct staff in response to what they find. I appreciate that, Ms. Varapetian. Any other new business?
Hey, Chair, Marion, it's Alex Farron.
Mr. Parhon?
Earlier, at the start of the meeting, you brought up the attendance for one of our our chairperson here. So, and I think per the Glendale Municipal Code, the 2.36.020 attendance requirements, it's 75% requirement to attend within the 12-month period, which I believe our Commissioner Sartorian has not met. So should we somehow do some sort of motion to determine what the plan is for Mr. Sartorian? That way we have a member that can be committed to attending meetings along with us so we can make appropriate decisions.
Thank you, Mr. Parhon. I'm going to ask for some guidance from Ms. Varapetian or staff regarding that question before I respond to it.
I think either Lynn or Ms. Williams can comment on this as well. But what we will do is prepare the record of his attendance and present it to the city manager's office, and request that the city manager bring up the item with the council member who appointed him, and then proceed from there.
Okay, does that require a motion in order to have that happen?
No.
Okay.
We'll do the follow-up. We'll bring it to the city manager's attention.
Fantastic, thank you. And maybe we can get some, or I can get some information on that along with whatever the plans are for internal audit, and then we can determine how to move forward. I appreciate that. Mr. Parhon, does that satisfy your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Any other new business?
Chairman, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'll wait.
This is Ed Kashadurian. I just want to mention that I just received an email from the city. As you know, I was nominated by a former council member, and because this council member is no longer serving, I believe that the new council member is going to nominate another person. I'm not exactly sure what the process is, but for the succession, I just want to let everyone know that this probably will be my last committee attendance, but I'm not exactly sure because I've had a chance to discuss this with the incoming council member. But hopefully, if he wishes me to continue, I will. If not, then I just want to kind of take a minute and thank everyone and wish everyone good luck.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Khatchdourian. Ms. Varpetian, I know we're skirting the line between comments and new business, but I would like to just say, if this is your last meeting, Mr. Khatchdourian, we really do appreciate your service, and hope that this won't be the last of your service, fine service to the city of Glendale.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Mr. O'Shaughnessy.
The governor mentioned when he said they were going to have to reopen the California state budget and have the subcommittees of both the Assembly and the State Senate to look at them, that there were only 3 major items that he wished them to consider, one being COVID-19, 2 being major wildfires, 3 being homeless. The question I would refer up for someone to ask is, because of the movement of fire trucks out of Glendale in support of other cities northward, whether there are funds that can be retrieved that haven't been covered because of federal or because of the wildfires, for any monies we could get back in for public service and fire in that activity. That's just a question. That's it.
Okay. Okay, and I'm sure staff heard you, and hopefully they will be responsive in some way to that question. There's no motion, right?
Correct. No, I was just an inquiry. I don't want to step ahead of the city on this one. This is one that other people above our pay grade need to look at.
Mr. Chair, this is Michelle Flynn, Director of Finance. We're following, as well as the City Manager's Office, the information coming out of the Governor's Office. In May, I believe they're going to be doing their revision on their budget, and if there's anything in there legislatively for anything that would apply to Glendale in any way, we will definitely be pursuing from the standpoint of either lobbying or working with the appropriate people in Sacramento.
Thank you, Ms. Flynn.
So thank you for that. Yes.
Thank you. Okay, if there is no further business, we'll move on to adjournment.
So move that we adjourn.
Mr. O'Shaughnessy moves that we adjourn. Do I have a second?
Second.
I have a second from Mr. Hachdurian, I believe.
Yes.
Hopefully that's not your last official act. We are adjourned.